Hi, my name is Angela Fox, and I work with the Indiana State Library and the Library Development Office, where I oversee the Indiana Public Library Annual Report. Section 7 of that report, Employment Data, aims to find out how many workers it takes to keep library doors open. This section is fairly straightforward. It asks you how many employees you have and how many hours they work, as well as having you classify them as librarians or support staff. That last bit is where it can get a little tricky because it can be a struggle to classify who is a librarian and who isn't. IMLS defines a librarian as persons with the title of librarian who do paid work that usually requires professional training and skill in the theoretical or scientific aspects of library work, or both, as distinct from its mechanical or clerical aspect. I realize that's still not as clear cut as some people would like it to be. What I personally take away from that definition, what I recommend to my directors, is a rule of thumb to help decide librarian versus non, where you look at the primary function of the position in question and ask yourself, would there be an MLS class for this? Of course, not every librarian is going to have an MLS, but you can ask yourself if their main duties are the sorts of things that might be taught in an MLS class. So, cataloging, reference work, reader's advisory, programming, these are all things that can and have been the focus of MLS classes. It's far less likely you'd see a class on shelving books or checking things in and out. The other rule of thumb I recommend using is something of a play on that famous Supreme Court ruling on obscenity. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. You may have a hard time defining librarian, but you may know it when you see it. So do a gut check and ask yourself, do you consider that role a librarian role? I think people sometimes shy away from labeling positions as support staff for fear that it may seem like they're being demeaning to the work that the people do, saying that it's somehow lesser than real library work. But we all know that's just not true. Libraries need librarians and support staff to function. So keep in mind, the intent of this section is to just collect information on the realities of library staffing. And one of those data points is just how many trained librarians versus support staff are required. One final note, aside from would this person be considered a librarian, the question I get asked the most in this section is how to classify a staff member who holds an MLS but isn't necessarily doing librarian work. In this case, we need you to look at the job and not the person holding it. Someone might have an MLS, but if they're working in a non librarian role, it wouldn't count as a librarian. Now that we're looking at the section itself, I'd like to draw attention to the part of the instructions at the top about counting vacancies. Include all positions funded in the library's budget, whether those positions are filled or not. Again, we need you to count all positions, even if they're temporarily unfilled. It helps when we are trying to get that idea of how many people work at libraries in the state and in the nation. We do start this section by asking about librarians. If you've done this survey before, please take note that this section is not in the exact same order as previous years. This year, we start by asking for the total number of all librarians, both with and without MLS degrees. In question 2, we ask you to report the total number of paid hours per week for all your librarians. And then question 3 is an automatic calculation of the full-time equivalent. So we take the number from 2 and divide it by 40. I do realize that not all libraries in Indiana use 40 hours as that full-time marker, but because this is part of a national survey and we want to be able to compare apples to apples across states, we're just all using that 40 hours. Question 4 goes on to ask about ALA MLS librarians specifically. How many of the librarians that you reported in question 1 have an MLS degree? Because it is a subset of question 1, it has to be equal to or smaller than the number reported there. If it's not, something's gone wrong. After we ask about librarians, we move on to ask about support staff, anyone else who works at the library. Courier, maintenance, IT, security, HR, business office, any of those roles. It will ask you to count how many there are, and again, the total number of paid hours per week they work. And then finally, the section is going to close by asking you the number of hours per week considered to be full-time employment in your library. So if it is something other than 40, here's where you can tell us. And that's it. That's section 7. If you have any questions about this or any other section, please feel free to reach out to me at the contact information shown there. If I'm not available or you wish to speak to someone else, you can always reach out to the Library Development Office at that toll-free number or the LDO email.